Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for people to arrive. As you all are coming in, just let us know where you're tuning in from. What brought you here today? Um, we'd love to hear from you. Just turning on the captions here for folks who will need the captions. I'll introduce myself as people are coming in. I'm Omar Acevedo, and I'm the literary program coordinator at the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut. Hartford is where I grew up, so it is very nice to be working where I grew up, just a mile from my mom's house, where I get to go have lunch sometimes. It looks like someone's from Columbia, Maryland. And I am sure more people will tell us where they're coming from. But I'll just start I'll just continue doing the introduction then. Um, so again, I'm Omar Acevedo. I'm delighted to host tonight's program for Sync, a memoir. First, I need to thank our sponsors. Our virtual programs are produced in part with support honoring the late Frank Lord. We are happy to honor his memory with these programs. We are also incredibly grateful to the Wish to All Foundation and Connecticut Public WNPR for supporting all of our virtual programs. As a nonprofit organization, the Mark Twain House and Museum depends on contributions to share our enriching programs like Sync, our education initiatives and other events in our community. If you can, please consider donating. There's a link on the website for that. And let's introduce our guests for this evening. We're welcoming Joseph Earl Thomas and Kiese Laymon for a discussion of Joseph's book, Sync, which is a coming-of-age memoir. Joseph Earl Thomas is a writer from Frankfurt, which is in Philadelphia, whose work has appeared or is forthcoming in VQR, N+1, Gulf Coast, The Offing, and the Kenyon Review. He has an MFA in prose from the University of Notre Dame and is a doctoral candidate in English at the University of Pennsylvania. He is an associate faculty member at the Brooklyn Institute for Social Research, as well as the director of programs at Blue Stoop in Philadelphia. Kiese Laymon is a Black Southern writer from Jackson, Mississippi. Laymon is the Libby Shern Moody Professor of English and Creative Writing at Rice University. He's the author of Long Division, How to Slowly Kill Yourself and Others in America, and Heavy, an American Memoir. Laymon is the recipient of the 2020-2021 Radcliffe Fellowship at Harvard and was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship in 2022. He is the founder of the Catherine Coleman Literary Arts and Justice Initiative, a program aimed at aiding young people in Jackson get more comfortable reading, writing, revising, and sharing on their own terms in their own communities. We encourage you to have a conversation in the chat. If you have a specific question, though, please post it in the Q&A section. We just don't want it to get lost in the chat. So if you have a question, put it in the Q&A section, which is on the bottom of your screen here. You can also click on captions or live transcript to see live auto captioning of this event. And finally, and perhaps most importantly, I will be putting a link in the chat to purchase Sync through our museum store. Your purchase will support our museum and our honored guest. So that is all from me. Please sit back and enjoy, and I'll turn this over to Joseph and Kiese.
You muted. The drone kept changing shape. I was like, "Oh, let me make sure I actually press the button on the right part now."
Thank you, Omar. Thank you, Kiese, for being here. And thank you, folks, for coming too. We were just chatting a little bit about a bunch of pseudo-related writing stuff before we started, but we decided I'm gonna read a little bit from the beginning, and we're just gonna get right into it. Because of all people, you're one of the folks I'm really excited to talk to about the book more broadly too, right? So I'll read from the beginning of the book. This, needs no explanation because it's the start of it, but I'll read for like 3-4 minutes, just a little bit. Of all the protagonists in this story, both real and imagined, just Joey, the boy, owned an easy bake oven. Owned it the way his grandfather, Pop-Pop, owned sound, like the sound of Joey's name sliding out of smoked black lips. Joy, he always said, Joy, come here. Joy was timid, to put it nicely. And the oven was purchased with the help of Capital One for his little sister, Mika, anyway. Joey had convinced Mika that she wanted one, and therefore, at 7, he received a gift that, through Pop-Pop's eyes, sat scandalous in the lap of his little black man in training. But Joey used it to make cheesecake, red velvet cupcakes, blackened salmon, fried chicken, and Chilean sea bass with dirty rice. The oven itself was tiny and pink, sitting on a fold-out dinner tray, flimsy and flower pattern, purchased from the Dollar General just 3 blocks away. And beneath the oven, Joey kept a black notebook. No one ever checked under there. Knowing he would make mistakes, he wrote only in pencil and yet always struggled to come back and revise. And he drew. He drew stories of lonely sea monsters, moving pictures with tiny speech bubbles sprouting from their mouths like in comic books. Some of them had rotten teeth and smelled bad. They were very long and green like giant snakes and constantly angry. One such creature had a hood like a cobra because Joey had watched Steve Irwin play with one on The Crocodile Hunter and thought it would make a good pet. Watching the emotive white man in khaki from Australia made Joey wonder about different kinds of danger, about how some forms of fear were cool and quick and entertaining and others were not. He imagined himself far away, like his sea creatures. Joey's sea creatures would say things like, "Grr, I'm gonna eat you," to humans rocking through waves on wooden boats. Then, without warning, the creatures would smash the poor human's vessel into pieces. On the page, wood splintered in brown oil pastel shards through a deep blue sea of unknowing. The sailors aboard all drowned or woke up sopping wet on tiny islands with just a single palm tree. Joey had questions about why, if granted only one tree, it should always be a species without fruit. But this was ultimately fine as artistically it felt good. Stranded, the survivors would ask a scuttling crab, why? Why did this happen? Scuttle was among Joey's favorite words. A survivor might, post-scuttling around, stand there in a yellow raincoat, weeping under acidic droplets falling from an ever-darkening sky, shaded by Joey's godlike thumbs and the side of a sharp pencil. Starving, the survivor would watch sea creatures gorge themselves on the ocean's bounty, a contradiction to the brackish water Joey had seen in the Schuylkill if ever there was one. A sea monster would drag an orca from the water, sometimes a baby, and slam its body brain first on the rocky shore over and over again. The blood was gratuitous, thick and red marker to glisten wet, making the page feel so soggy and smell so good, till it dried up and warped in brittle position. Upon seeing the bloody orca smashed into those rocks, a survivor might ask the sea creature why he did it. Why slam them around like that? Were they not dead enough? In the front of the same black book, Joey wrote names in dark red lines, tracing over them several times, each first, middle, and last, no initials. He'd work himself into a fury, talking to these names in his own head, overly simple dialogue, strange and unnecessary questions with no real answers, like ones forced upon a child in real life. Let's say, why you hold your wrists like that? Joey wanted these names, these people, to die. Or, he thought, if people are going to die inevitably, young or old or in pain or otherwise, these people should jump the line. Adults will find this cruel, but not as cruel as Joey found them. And he could never do the killing himself because, well, he was a coward, which never curtailed his devotion to such death in theory. He did not consider himself a supervillain. He would toe a careful line somewhere between the kind of man that his mother, Kiese, might be afraid of and the kind that could protect her if he ever, past 7, might be something more than both at the same time. And I'll stop right there. But that just gives a little bit of introduction of what the book sounds like, or maybe what it feels like, or some of the things I'm trying to think about or do in it, for folks who have.
I'm so happy to be here with you. First of all, I want to encourage you all. If you don't already have Sync, you need to get it, and it's definitely one of them books you need to get 2 or 3 or 4 copies of, so you can share with your friends, so y'all can link up and feel and think and talk through. I also want to encourage y'all, if you have questions, to put them either in the chat or the question and answer, and then we'll blend them into the conversation as organically as possible. I'm so happy to be here talking to you, Phil.
Man, thank you. Yeah,
I feel
thank
like
you.
in real life, like, we fuck with each other heavy. So I was trying to think about when you sent me this joint. Was it 2019?
Man, it was like 4 or 5 years ago or something like that. Yeah, it was that version. It was like at the halfway point. This was before, like, I didn't have an agent or none of this, because I was asking you about PJ too.
Right.
So this was, yeah, it was a while back.
Yeah, and so
It was
our
like,
connection. Go ahead.
yeah, no, it was around the time Vona was in Philly.
It was because that's when we met, right?
Yeah, that's when we met him. I think I had like hit you up on something.
Yeah.
But then we had met in person at Vona.
And did we meet again out west, or was it just Vona? Did you come out west too?
It was at Vona, but I never got
Did
the
you go to
chance to come out
House?
west.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't get a chance to come out west. Yeah.
This is the thing. Let me say, this is my first impression of you, right? Because we first see each other. You sent me this email. I hadn't really read any of your stuff at that point, and I'm much older, and I'm that age where you like to talk about ball and relive your golden days. And you was that age where you still wanted to play ball. You remember that shit? You was like, yo, you want to go play ball? I was like, you even want to play ball, bro? Like,
I was like, who all gonna be there at the vote? I was like, oh, let me hit some of these niggas up, probably trying to play ball, like, because I knew, you know what I mean, there was places that we could go.
Yeah, I mean, that's my first memory. I was like, oh, these niggas playing ball now. Like, I play ball. But listen, fam, like, I just want to say, I have so many questions. But before I say anything, I just want to say what you already know, which is, I really, really love what you're doing with the memoir, and really what you're doing with, like, fiction and nonfiction forms in this book. And when I say love, I'm saying, like, you pushed me from the first time I read any of it. You pushed me to be like a more daring writer. You pushed me to take every line seriously. But I just also want to ask some of these hard questions that I ask myself, and that sometimes people ask me before we get into the text. And one of them is that, if you haven't gotten this yet, I'm sure you will. But, we're also in a space and time where people are looking to Black people who write about, I'm just going to say, hard things, and say, are you exploiting your trauma? Are you trauma dumping? Are you, people, and I think a lot of people who use this word trauma have thought a lot about it, thought a lot about the word. And I think some people who use the word haven't thought about it at all. I think some people think trauma means shit that doesn't feel good. And I think other people have to take a different understanding of trauma. But I'm interested, Joe, in, like, how you fucking, like, meet that question of how and why you're writing through hard things in ways that might feel hard to the reader. Like, how do you approach that question now? And I know you've gotten it if you haven't, and if not, you will get it. How do you approach that big, like, heavy question?
I mean, I think that's really good. I mean, I love the way you asked that, right? Because the kind of question about trauma, I think that's really true, where, you encounter all these conversations where it's like, if somebody haven't thought about it at all, and then somebody who's like, I do, trauma theory or whatever, whatever the case is.
Right.
But I think, my first answer, because I know, I mean, you read a lot. I mean, and that's like my world, right? It's like just fucking reading everything.
Yeah.
And then being like, what kind of conversations I can have with what I'm reading. And one of the things that used to really frustrate, or maybe still does frustrate me a lot, right, is like when hard shit is happening, but it feels easy to the reader. I really don't like, when something like really fucked up is happening in the book, but somehow you get to just like glance over it and kind of keep moving with, whatever other like plot is happening. I cannot stand it. It makes me so mad. And there was like moments for me, I think, with like hard shit in literature and then in like life, right? So in literature, I was thinking about like, when in like I Know What a Caged Bird Sings, when Maya Angelou gets raped and the bull gets locked up, but he gets out, and then they kill him, right? Yeah. It's like,
Yeah.
That is like an extent to which I'm like, oh, in my mind, that makes perfect sense, right? And I'm not even like the retributionist type.
Right.
No, but also like in my own life, this felt very kind of like naturalistic, real.
Yeah.
There's like there's moments like that where I'm like, okay, or if you're reading like The Bluest Eye and you're thinking about like violence that children deal with,
Yeah.
right? These are
Yeah.
like some of the books that come to mind, like
Yeah.
really. And this other book, that Tanya Tagaq wrote, Split Tooth, was super important to me in thinking about like the kind of violence that children deal with. That sometimes we're just, especially when it's a child, right? We're kind of just like, oh, okay, well, this was just a brief episode in their life,
Yeah.
and now they're grown now. And
Right.
the only time we really get that kind of shit is like, oh, this grown ass person is in like therapy, and,
Right.
or when the writer wants to explain why their adult life, why they're doing something as an adult, like they
Yeah.
did this because they dealt with this trauma as a kid or whatever.
Right.
And one of the big questions, I was like, okay, well, what if you stay in that space for a long ass time, for as long as you can, and maybe like respect the kind of whatever kind of narrative possibilities or emotional intellectual possibilities are there as a kid,
Yeah.
rather than being like the kid stuff only matters because I'm now an adult who has like resources and shit, and it's like fucking up my job or whatever. I was kind of
Right.
like, well, I
Right.
want to know about a lot of the kid stuff more. This is like Black Boy, right? I was like, when young Richard becomes adult Richard, I was like, nah, stay in the
Fam.
I was
what?
like,
I feel
stay
that
kid.
too. Remember the beginning of Boys in the Hood where they're children, where they're
Yeah.
kids? Like I actually think that was the best part of the movie.
Yeah, it was,
Yeah.
it was. A lot of those are always the best parts, I feel like that a lot about a lot of the shit that I like. I'm like, oh, stay in the early times. And the other part of it, so that's like a kind of like literary part of it. The other part was like the whole time, I mean, my main job as like a grown person was I was a medic in the Army, and then I was also working in this hospital in North Philly, in the emergency department. And, like the kind of conversations I was having with people and what I would see all the time, it was like almost always hard shit, right? Like, I mean, people don't go to the ER for fun and, shit like that. So that was a big part of it. And when I was trying to reconstruct scenes, so I'm like, doing a thing where talking to my mom, talking to my grandfather, I'm like recording some conversations, other conversations I'm not. And I would ask them about their childhoods a lot. And if I thought something was fucked up that had to do with like the childhood I had or new people around, which was like everybody, right? It's not like
Right.
I hate the kind of thing where it's like, oh, special me or whatever.
Yes.
Like my thing was. I'm like, no. This is like a lot of people, like most of the people I grew up with,
Right.
had some kind of related experience. That was all, really, really difficult shit. But a lot of times in that difficult shit, like laughter came out of that too. This is like a kind of, everybody doesn't always like this, but especially talking to like my mother, grandfather, like brother, sister, a lot of like laughter or other interesting shit came up in a lot of the hard stuff. And so I wanted to deal with that, The last thing I'll say about that is I was writing a bunch of other work, stories, fiction, and I just kept lying and writing around the things that I wanted to focus on. So I was like, you know what? Let me be honest and talk to my aunt about this and see what I can like make out of it on the page and turn it into a set of questions rather than being like, this is what it is, this is how you should feel about it,
Right.
etc.
And one of the things I love about your work is that like I don't want to speak for everyone else, but like I can't read any sentence you write and not at once feel propelled into the narrative scene, the situation that you're describing, or just the literature. And I can't read any sentence you write without also like being dizzied by the craft. But I'm interested in this notion that a lot of people like share about Black autobiographical writing now, which is when you're lingering, right? When you're lingering in the childhood space, or like the preteen space or the teenage, like, do you try not to hurt your reader? This is a thing that my students are really, really focused on now.
Yeah, that
I
is.
don't want to hurt my reader. I don't want to make are you trying not to hurt a reader? Are you trying here's my real question. Are you ever trying to hurt your imagined reader?
That's a harder question. That's a harder question. Yeah.
I'm gonna ask you.
That's a hard. I mean, no. So this is good. So I get that question a lot too, like in teaching, right? Like where nobody wants to like deliberately hurt the reader. And I'm like, I don't know, man. So, okay, so about me, a lot of the literature that I love is because it hurts
Yeah.
me in some way. Or like sometimes the hurt isn't even, so it's like the other thing is like, okay, is it the literature hurting you, or is it because the literature is reminding you of something in the world or whatever, it's relating to something in the world that is hurtful, that maybe we get to ignore when we're not reading, right?
Right.
And
Right.
sometimes I feel like that, right? I'm
Yeah.
like sometimes that's the exciting thing for me about the literature, but I don't. I would say I'm not trying to deliberately hurt the reader, and the other thing. So when I think about like the reader, folks that I'm thinking about reading this are like primarily people that I had already fucked with before I was a writer at all,
Yeah.
right? So it's like y'all, like black writers that I really fuck with on one end, and then on the other end, it's like people that I played ball with, people that
Yeah.
I still kick it with in Philly, my sister, my mom, like all them, right? As
Right.
part of like a really honest conversation about that, and a lot of them, a lot of them were like, oh, this is kind of funny, or it would be like, actually you could have went harder, or you was really nice to this person who really was
Yeah.
more fucked up than you are willing to tell. And then there
Right.
was a handful of folks who was like, don't write that, don't put that shit in there. It was a handful of folks, but most people had the response of like, who I had came up with was like, yeah, actually, you could have went harder, right?
Yeah.
Like, do you remember? It was like it would lead into, do you remember this time when this thing
Yeah.
happened? Do you remember this time when this other shit happened? So I would say, like, I'm not trying to hurt readers, but I feel like I'm not that worried about it either.
Yeah. Yeah.
'Cause I don't think we should be worried. If it doesn't, for me, if it doesn't hurt, it's something that's not that's not going on that I want to be happening
Right.
for me
Right.
as like a reader and a writer. Because it's so, especially if you're doing something like memoir, you playing with, fiction, nonfiction, whatever. It's
Yeah.
like you got some relation to like the world or whatever. And for me, part of my main concerns is like, for a lot of young black folks, the world does feel fucked up. It doesn't always feel good. There's and I try to be clear about this in the book, right? There's all these times where shit does feel good, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah.
But sometimes I think the even worse part is like sometimes there's shit that feels good that is actually very fucked up
Absolutely.
to someone else, and that's important too. So I'm like, if you can't, I don't want to stretch it too far, but for me, I'm like, all right, it's okay
Yeah.
that this thing felt that it hurt.
And I feel like one of the things you do in sync is you like, it's like, I mean, I'm trying to think of the metaphor. It's like, you like double dutch like these like ropes of intimacy on one level, of immersion in like culture, like, the folks that made you. And then the way people are talking about the book now, and I want to know what you think about this. Like, there's almost the way that people are reading this book is like geek culture got you out. When I read it,
Uh-huh.
it's like geek culture brought you in, and like being in, like allowing yourself in, helped you make. And I love that you keep on talking about the word like make when you talk about making these books, making these scenes. And so I want to talk about the use of the third early on, but I also want to talk about the way people are using geek, what people call geek culture that's
Yeah.
like seemingly outside of black culture, to use this trope of like that's how Joe got out. This is how Joey got out. But do you buy into that? Did it bring you, did quote unquote geek culture bring you in more? And like, how do you feel about that sort of metaphor of like black boys always needing something to help us get out?
Yeah, I cannot stand. Like it's two versions of that, right? Like one of them is like a marketing thing. It has to do
Right.
with marketing, right? Which I'm horrible at. Like
Yeah.
I make no pretensions to be like, oh, I'm good at marketing the shit. I think I'm okay at like making the thing, but
Yes.
like the marketing terrible. And I'm like, okay, like I could see certain readers and like a lot of demographics being like, okay, this is a way that I can get into this book to some extent. And then the other part about it is like that it makes me so mad that there's always a thing that's like it makes me so mad that there's always a thing that's like, oh, this is how somebody got out, or this is what, because like for me, a big part of the book was like, one of the questions, right, like that I was starting at with the book was like, how do you, what do you do if you're in a situation where that doesn't happen? Like that's like literally the question. So like if you, so we know that like, you know, systems are fucked up or failing or whatever. It's like the school ain't quite working out, you know, don't give a fuck, kind of all kinds of other social supports. The family is not always the easiest, you know,
Right.
place to get through whatever, no matter how much they might love you or make attempts to do so, because in part because of the world. And so I was like, I was asking the question like, damn, what if like you don't have some really good teacher that saves you, or you are a really good athlete, or you could fucking, you know, rap, or like some of these other tropes or whatever. And I think the thing that comes closest to doing that in the book when people read it is like, oh, playing video games and anime and stuff
Mm-hmm.
like that. So I think for me, I think that's like a narrative problem that we just have, particularly like
Absolutely.
as Americans, right? Like we need a kind of narrative, like beginning to end, like started from the bottom, now we hear type shit, to for it to work in our brains. You know what I
Right.
mean?
Right.
And so I mean, I don't believe that. So like what I really think about, and this is especially like later teenagers, I'm like, damn, you know, geek or nerd or whatever culture is also just as like kind of fucking white, racist, sexist
Yeah.
as every other culture. You know what I mean? Like
Right.
it's not a particular thing, right? But it's also like this happened to be the kind of shit that I got pleasure from
Yeah.
most when I was a young person. It doesn't mean that, you know, it's like in and of itself, it's a way out of a situation. So I tried, right, to be like, there is no one thing at all
Right.
that is gonna like rescue me and by extension us from
Right.
whatever situation. You know what I mean? It fucking helps to have shit that you like, that you're good at. Helps more than anything to
Really
have
does.
friends, to have
Really
kin. You
does.
know, like that shit is like really. But even then, it don't guarantee. That's not guaranteeing shit. You know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But you still need that, right? Even though that's not a guarantee, you still kind of
And
need.
we build, and what I love about what you do too is that, like, I think sometimes people forget that and I'm talking about black boys right now, like we made so much culture around these things that people consider nerd culture, right?
Yeah,
Like we made culture around that shit. And that's one of the things I love about you is that, like, you know, I mean, you sit in and meditate like your relationship with like the extra cultural, or like to become part of our culture, like, but you also constantly remind us that, like, your engagement with this culture is cultural, right? Like it's cult, like you're bringing blackness to this space, and this space is also like becoming a different sort of shape. But talk to me about the use of the third though, fam. Like,
yeah,
I'm interested, I want to talk about, and I'm sure people will hit you with this one too much, but I want to know what the third allowed you to do, in the making, versus like the selling. Like, what did the third allow you to do
yeah.
in the making?
Yeah, I mean, in the making. So, like, I mean, you're a great person to ask this question, though. I think because it's something that you do that I don't think I'm good at, right? Which is like the transition between like narrative and exposition while staying in the kind of narrative, right? So like the that movement from like the really really specific like intensity of feeling to like the global expansive,
Yeah.
and then back down and then back and forth. And I really wanted to be like, to have the book be really focused on the interior, but to not do any of the like expository
Yeah.
stuff, right? In part because I was like, okay, I want to remain with like the vocabulary, thought patterns, um, ideology, or whatever we're gonna call it, of like a child or like
Yep.
child self from that in those ages. And one of the ways to do that was to be like, okay, I'm taking the I out of it, and I'm like trying not to interrupt the
Mhm.
child with my adult self.
Mhm.
And as an initial sense is like, okay. And I also want people to be able to read the book and think of me, like the child me, as a character in a way that I'm also thinking about the me as a character. Because, you know, like when you write memoir, I think everybody kind of automatically not everybody, but a lot of people automatically think like, oh, I know exactly everything about you. Like you have said it. And I'm like, this is, you know, this shit is not every, you know, not everything.
Right, right, right.
But I was trying to draw attention to the fact that like it's a form, right? It's like a set of conscious decisions that you make, and in the third person, I felt like keeping the narrative thread, but like interior kind of intensity better. It worked better, or it felt good. The humor and the violence, or like the transitions between those two, for me, moved better, and the language was more like one of the ways to say this. In revision, the language was more tolerable to me,
Got you.
and I felt it was at the kind of it gave the appropriate amount of space for readers too to enter into it, right? And the third kind of work, I will say, like, this John was in a bunch of different tenses, persons, whatever, and my homegirl was like, "What the fuck is you doing? Like, this shit, like, you gotta pick something and chill. Like, you can't just do everything or whatever you want and think that is, like, comprehensible or whatever." So I ended up after a while settling on, okay, it works. What I wanted to do in this sense works best in the third for the most part.
Yeah, and then there's a movement. I mean, you move to a second. There's a movement that happens here. I'm wondering if you could talk for. I want to read this one section that this is just only a few sentences. Okay, so it starts like this. Silence was hard though, because all the slightly older, meaner variants of children were in love with Jay-Z, shoving it down Joey's throat, blasting reasonable doubt all the time. Confusing. But Jay-Z, with all his strength and money and shorties and blunts and clothes and big grown man dick, just made Joey feel weaker and more inferior. Jay-Z was completely unrelatable and kind of scary. Jay-Z was Pop-Pop on a yacht with an expensive top hat and pinky ring. I love that shit. In years to come, Joey would try not to let slip how much he liked Destiny's Child or Drew Hill, but someone always found out. Tia would mimic Cisco's Unleash the Dragon following. It's just like that kind of lingering, right? Like lingering. And you could have said that in a sentence, right? You could have left it at Jay-Z with all the strength and money and shorties just made Joey feel weaker and more inferior. But you sit and you circle and you circle. But we got to talk about this. Jay-Z was a pop-up. How do you pronounce that? Pop-up?
Yeah.
Jay-Z was a pop-up on a yacht. Talk about pop-up, because this is a question too that we have in the chat right now. From Manuel, does pop-up ever acknowledge or apologize for what he did? Talk to me about that.
Yeah, I mean, so like the image that I was thinking about, in this era, it's like the Big Pimpin' video and shit, where they like on the yacht and the, like all white parties was the motherfuckers still be having a lot of all white parties, but
really do.
It's in Miami. Oh my God! But that's like the image, right? And my grandfather, probably he was one of those dudes who would like dress fly for like random nothing occasions, and had that like that air about him, right? That people didn't really want to fuck with him, but it was like an idea that women wanted him. You know what I mean? Even though he didn't have money, he had. I mean, this is the other thing, right? When people talk about like poverty, there's a bunch of other shit to talk about, like intergenerational poverty. It's like you can be broke and you could still look like you got money to the other people on your block or whatever, for however long. Mm-hmm. And he was one of those type of dudes, and he. One of the things that he did was like carry that persona in public all the time, right? It was like that persona and the kind of like, I gotta take care of these kids kind of persona. Basically, I mean, and by take care of these kids, it wasn't like, we about to like cuddle and you gonna get whatever you want for dinner or whatever the fuck. He was like, no, I'm gonna fuck you up if you ain't tough enough or whatever. So this is, I mean, to the question about like, apology or whatever. He apologized all the time, like especially when I got older, right? But even in the book, there's the moment I like to include the moment where he's apologizing afterwards. He's like, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do you like that," or whatever. And it reminds me like, oh, this person is a person. Even when I'm a kid, I'm like, oh, he's he's trying to apologize. But also like, I think the thing that sometimes we forget is like, when motherfuckers whooping your ass, they think that they're doing the right thing. They feel like, but that's the reason why they're doing it. They're not doing it because it's fun or you know what I mean? Usually to them in the best. If you want to do the most generous reading, right? Like motherfuckers whoop your ass because they're like, we want to make sure that, other shit ain't happening to you out in the world or whatever. Yeah. You know what I mean? And he was definitely he was like, I mean, he's basically like, I'm gonna die. you about to take charge of this shit because ain't nobody else in here working or whatever. This is like his words,
Right.
whatever. So you need to get it together. I don't give a fuck how old you is. That was like his mood, his mode. But you know, when he got older, and he just died like almost a month ago now. Actually,
Wow.
he just passed. And as he got older, you know, he got like more apologetic. He would have his moments. You know, he's a person, right? He would be more apologetic sometimes. Sometimes he would be bitter and just generally talking shit or whatever. You know,
Yeah.
he read this essay that I wrote about him, or at least some parts of it in the offing. He was like, "Oh, you punk ass over here writing essays and shit. You think you fucking cute? You know what I mean? Like you little ungrateful motherfucker or whatever." He's like, "And you ain't even come over here. I told you I was having a cookout." You know, this is like the kind of dude that we're talking about here. So I mean, he did. You know, he had. I respect a certain kind of honesty that he actually did have about doing fucked up shit later, which I think a lot of people
Yeah.
would never come to. But you know, I think he remained. I mean, he remained who he was, like
Right.
through and through, kind of in and out,
I
right?
feel that. You know, and the way you write about him makes me want to ask. I love that I can ask you questions that I think I can ask you questions that I often want to ask people, but you know, you got to ask the you know other version. But I'm interested in like what parts of this book that were hard to write
Yeah.
actually also felt the most pleasurable to make. So what parts of this book that were emotionally, psychologically hard to enter
Ooh,
also felt the most pleasurable in making?
that's a tough question. I I think maybe part of the beginning,
Yeah.
anything that had to do with my aunt was really hard to write. And I was scared. I mean, for a lot of reasons, I was scared of her, not like as adult people, but I was scared of talking to her about the book and
Right.
being like, "Yo, I'm writing this. Like, what do you think?" Or I was mostly scared that I would get like it would be a situation where she would be like, "I don't know what the fuck you talking about. Like, none of this never happened."
Yeah.
Because that's a fear too, right? Because
Yeah.
that's that's one of the main ones, and that was something that I was going around like avoiding and then talking about
Mm-hmm.
in other ways or other contexts or whatever. And that shit was really, really hard for me to do. And it took a long time. And that ended up being like one of the last things that I really went through. But talking to her and being like, I mean, I don't know if she would mind. She's like, "Oh yeah, I remember that. Like, make sure you change my name and stuff, right? Because I want the kids to be able to read, the
Right.
book and stuff like that." And and I was like, okay, like I respected the shit out of that. And then writing that allowed me, or it let me think about, or it allowed me to write the most pleasurable parts, which were like the summer
Yeah.
like parts, like those like interludes where we were just like going around every summer doing bad kid shit or whatever.
Right.
Those parts were super pleasurable to me. And there were like moments where fucked up shit was happening, but it felt very, very good, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I felt closer to her because she was also like my closest friend growing up until towards the end of the book, right? Where because she's a little bit older than me, and you get to that weird age when you be like 12 or 13, and somebody is like 15, 16, and then you just kind of encounter that split. But I
Yeah.
think I think that the beginning, anything that had to do with sex or like what do I call it, dry humping, sexual
Right.
desire and
Right.
sexual intensity, that shit was a lot harder to write. But I realized like, oh, a lot of this book is actually about that.
Yeah.
And I was like, and I was dodging it for too long.
You had to you were into the writing of the book when you discovered the force of sex in the book. Like you didn't
Yeah.
want yeah.
Because I was writing essays about like sex or whatever.
Right.
So I mean, part of the impetus. So I had gotten, and I don't know if my homie is here. Listen, I had gotten drugged at like this thing that me and my homie were at,
Wow.
and after that, I was writing about and thinking about this kind of shit more broadly. And I was talking to friends and family about stuff, and I realized like, oh yeah, like I really was dodging this. And also, my homegirl, different person, called me out on like, oh, you really, who read all these short stories I wrote and all this other stuff, like you really be dodging a sex question, huh? Like you would think you would think that you would never. And I was like, you know what? I'm not, and it was one of those moments I was like, yeah, I'm really not being honest enough about this. So
Right.
that was the hardest work. What those
I mean, I know the book just came out, but this book has been quote unquote done for a minute, right?
Yeah.
And when you go back, like, talk to me about what you just said now, like with the book being in the world a few days old, and folks are not, because people don't read and think about the ways, like, you had to make those scenes that are about sex. You had to make that shit,
Yeah.
right? And people just read it as like it happened. I'm interested in like how you experience that now as a writer, right? Like knowing that people are reading, like literally reading into your body experiences, often without taking into consideration the making of those experiences from the
Yeah.
writer. Like, talk to me about that if you can.
Yeah. I feel like, so you asked a good question. I feel like, I'm glad I'm talking to you about this too, because I mean, I think that is one of the realest things that happens, right? Like, somebody be like, oh, this thing happened, the lights went off, the door closed, kind of like
Right.
literary performance of,
Right.
like this problem. And, so for me, like getting back into some of those
Yep.
scenes, what I tended to remember first was like either getting my ass beat for doing something or like rejection. And I think it feels lazy to kind of stop there, right? I think that sometimes that happens, right? It's like if you hold on too much to like the rejection scenario happen or like getting your ass beat or something, that's not necessarily like crafting it. That's just like telling you what the fucking, like narrative end of the thing was or how that happened. But I'm also like, those are like these super intense moments that I feel frustrated for being able to skip over. And the other thing is like nobody wants to talk about like sex and kids like at all, right?
Yeah.
Motherfuckers won't even talk to their own teenage kids about sex, which is like a wild thing. I just can't imagine.
Right.
And folks will start getting mad about that and immediately read that as like pornographic or whatever. But you know what I mean? Like the truth is the other problem is like some of my earliest experiences with other people were about sex.
Yeah.
Or about touch, or they're about like sexual desire, right? With whether it was with girls or boys, it was just like one of the first things I'd be like that I noticed myself wanting to be close to other people's bodies had to do with that. So it was a problem to be like, all right, well, how come that shit's not, being detailed or like drawn out or whatever, including the moments where you feel like you're doing something wrong, right? The earliest moments, not like later when you got all the language to describe like this and that or whatever, but those kind of early times. And, making the scenes for me starts with that kind of stuff. It's like, all right, well, where do I start learning something about something that's fucked up, but I can't describe it. And if you can't use a word as a stand-in, right, then you have to be as specific as possible. Yeah. And for me, like a lot of this shit in literature in general, right, is about being like trying to be as specific as possible about a scene within a set of like sentences, right, as close as you can get to it. And I mean, that's what I wanted to do, right? I didn't want to be like, oh, I can just choose these other words to make it easier on everybody.
Yeah.
But rather like putting that shit out there as a set of decisions that are being made by a bunch of people, not just me, not just the other person in the room, but by a bunch of people that lead to, a lot of either discomfort, violence, or whatever that comes a little bit later.
Yeah.
But like, I don't know. Usually I feel like I prepared myself in a lot of ways because so much shit wasn't a secret either. With regards to like when other people asked, I was like, oh, like everybody knows, like everybody that I already knew before I read the book knows. So when strangers ask me, I'm like, I
feel that. I feel that. I mean, I want to make sure we get this question too about from Manuel. Did you face any pushback to including specific people in your story? I guess you kind of talked about that with your aunt a bit, but yeah, which wasn't even really pushback. There were some people who were like, yeah, no, absolutely not. Or some people who were self-important enough to ask me like, you ain't read about me in that book, did you? Like they came to me, that's find out. I'm
like,
Yo, somebody hit me with that shit last week. I was like, you mad at me, fam? Because I didn't write about you in my memoir?
yes,
Like,
yes,
not my autobiography, my fucking memoir, right? Like,
yes.
some audacity. But go ahead.
Yeah, yeah, that happened. So that happened a couple times. I was like, no, I'm not. Don't worry about it. I'm not writing about shit. But I didn't get, you know what I mean? I didn't get no pushback. The person who like would have thought I would have got the most pushback would have been my grandfather, but he was the person who was like the most honest about
Yeah.
shit also, And I also tried not to portray him as like some pure villainy type shit either,
You definitely
anybody.
did. You definitely did. I mean, I mean, you just can write your ass off, fam. And a lot of times I don't think we're clear about what that means. But one of the things it means to me is that you have the will to care for every character you write about, but you also have the skill to like make that care manifest. You know what I'm saying? You can want to motherfucking care for people all you want, but if you don't have the skill to actually make that shit, and that's one of the things that makes this book so incredible. It's like, you rocking and rock. I'm like, oh shit, like this is not one of those books where it's like you're gonna feel blank color for this character. The colors that you feel for characters are gonna perpetually change, like no matter what the characters are doing or experiencing. And I really love that.
Yeah, thank you.
Lacey Ward asked, were there any past memories of revelation that you uncovered during or because of your writing?
Yeah, that's a good question too. Thank you for that question, Lacey. I mean, for me, and this was like part of the impetus for writing the book too. It was like rather than things, it was about like ways of like the way that I thought that I thought was more valuable sometimes than the way I think now. And I use this explanation a lot. I'd be like, sometimes when you're a kid, there's a lot of like fucked up shit that we just go through every day that we think is like okay, that standards or whatever norms that we uphold, whether they're about like big things, racism, sexism, classism, etc., or like kind of other general shit, right? So like my kids, when they find out about shit like rent, or like how much groceries cost or whatever, they don't say like, oh, I need to make more money to get like I need to need to get another job to get the groceries or pay the rent. They're like, well, this is like fuck. They don't curse. They're like mostly real. They think that shit is diabolical. But they're like, this is horrible. Like, how could anybody who makes these decisions? Which is another way of asking like, why did y'all fuck the world up so much and expect us to just go along with that shit and act like everything is okay? And when I was a kid, I had that all the time about everything. I was fucking insufferable. And I think that that's for a lot of people, for a lot of adults, right? Like they were annoyed by that. A lot of adults who were dealing with their own shit, that probably annoyed the hell out of them, right? And, I feel like it's important sometimes not to lose that. And it's like sometimes when we become adults and you work in like 4 or 5, 6 jobs, you got your own kids, your own other shit going on, you're responsible for other people. And, like sometimes you don't have time to like launch into all this other shit because you gotta go to work. Right. And I wanted to keep that kind of pattern of thinking where like, oh, there's a lot of shit that's actually really, really wrong. But, when I was a kid, I had time maybe, or I didn't know how to use language to just make it okay.
Right.
And I didn't want to use language to make it okay. And I'm trying to do that more as an adult. And that's the hard part about writing for me.
I think about what you said about so many adults in your life kind of knew some of what happened in terms of like plot points in the book, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like some of the adults in your life knew. But you also in real life when we talk, you always talk about the kids. Yeah, that's what's interesting when you talk about pop out. You was like, them kids, and with our culture sometimes like people be like, man, fuck them kids, but it doesn't mean fuck them kids.
It don't.
It does not mean fuck them kids. But so I'm really interested, Joe. You can talk about what it means for you to put this book in the world, and with the probability that your kids will one day read this part of you because they can't necessarily yet. Fully. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, man. So the one thing, a lot of people will disagree with me on this, right? Like, I don't lie to my kids about, real life. Like, if they ask me a question, like, I don't really sugar. If somebody, my kid asks me about sex, or if my kid asks me about, literature, like, I don't, ban books in my house. I don't ban any media, really. I'm just like, you are allowed to like watch what you want. I hope that you ask a lot of questions about whatever it is that you watch, read, etc. And sometimes, they get really annoyed. Like my oldest, he'd be like, damn, I don't even know if I want to do this because then I'm gonna have to talk to you about that shit. Like, however long. Or he'd be like, yo, like you always making everything seem more complicated than it really is. I'm like, yo, but it is complicated, you know. But they're, but I'm lucky in the sense that like they're like smart, they're curious. Even the ones, even the 5-year-old, even the twins too. And they was at the library when the book launched, right? Like, with my friends and them holding them or sitting with them and everything. And my sister was there with her kids who were even younger. And I kind of like, I feel like kids should be trying to understand whatever they feel like they, you know, whatever they want. I mean, I don't really, and so part of it is like, so my oldest, he read the book.
Wow.
He's 12, and
Damn.
and he'll ask me questions. I'll be like, yeah, so this is how, because they don't know. The other thing, right, is like now because of who I have become, or like who, like their moms should have become, their life is so different, right? That they don't have to think about this shit. They'd be like, want to ask me like, oh, why you heating up a pot of water on the stove? I'm like,
Wow.
man, no fucking heat. You know what I mean? Like, and that was one of the ways you get warm water or whatever. But I'm like, I try to answer the questions as best I can. But I think, that shit gets written off as like, there's like obscene shit or whatever. This is like too much. It's like, pornographic or what have you. And I'm like, that shit, how? When the person in the book is 7, 8, 9,
No,
10,
exactly.
whatever.
Exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that goes back to the harm thing, right? With the reader question.
Right.
Right? It's like, are you trying to harm your reader? And I'm like, no. I mean, the conversation I'm trying to have with like other books, specifically like other Black people, especially young Black folks, and the world is like, this shit is already taken part. But I do want to slow it down to be like, this is a space where you could think about it that is actually safer than going to some, whatever person, especially if you don't have nobody in your life,
Brian Lynn, incredible writer, writes, building off of his my question about the third person, can you talk more about the narrator? Yeah. Decisions you made about the voice, persona, relationship to Joey. Did you define the narrator as a distinct? Yeah, I think you kind of explored that. You want to add anything to that? Did you define the narrator as a distinct character for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big part of that distinction, Brian, thank you for that question, who is also a phenomenal writer, was like naivete too, right? Like I wanted the child me, I wanted to explain the fact that I didn't know a bunch of shit.
Right.
Whereas like I think now when you, especially if you end up going to college, right? Like especially if you're one of the few people in your family or whatever who go to college, you're encouraged to act like you know every fucking thing, which is it's a horrible way. Like it's like not a good way to be in the world, right? Like when you enter a space and people like kind of demand that more than other people. Sometimes even when my kids ask me stuff, I'm like, I actually don't know. Like you have to look that up. Like I have no fucking idea. But I don't want you to act like you do know and then just go off all fucking cocky or whatever and pretend to everybody. Yeah. So I think that was one of the things that was like, not only did I not always know the words, but I didn't understand as much about the world as I thought I did at the time. And I wanted to make sure that there was all this kind of like incomplete, understanding about everything, about whether it was about sex, about like my own body, about like other people's bodies, about the art that I was like listening to or playing or whatever. So that was super important. And it's the opposite, I think, of the world that we're in now. If you write something or if you study literature or whatever, it's like, no, tell us how sure you are about everything. And I'm like, that's not even interesting. You know what I mean? Like, so that was important for me.
I feel that. I love that. And one of the last questions that I wanted to ask you is, when we put out any sort of art that, on the surface or whatever it is about us and our insides, I'm wondering if you can talk about your joy, your anxiety around selling it, right? Like, and I get that you sold the book, and you sold we often we're selling books, people don't understand we're selling ideas, and they buy into the idea, and then we have to try to finish the book. But what does it feel like now to know that people are out in the world, like 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 transactioning, giving somebody money to get what you made, which is in some way an amalgamation of your insides. Like, talk to me
Yeah.
about like what it means in some way, or if you would agree with this or not. Like, are you and are we selling the making or remaking of our insides? And if so, what do you feel about that?
Damn. You know, I guess what I'll say to that is like I definitely do agree that that's exactly what's happening, right? To varying degrees. And it's something about the the way that something like a text that takes like, I don't know, whatever, 8, 9 years or something like that to write, or however long it takes, that's different from the other kind of selling, right? So when you
Yeah.
said the word sell, I think about like, what is the shit that I was doing for money before this?
Yeah.
Right? Like before any of this stuff, which was like, I was in the army, right?
Right.
I was
Right.
for a long time. I was a medic in the army, and I'm like, that is a certain kind of like direct
Absolutely.
selling, right?
Yep.
To perform, all these kinds of violence that, most of us going in don't fucking want nothing to do it. Don't agree, like a bunch of
Right.
people that I was in with, especially like black dudes from Philly, nobody was like a patriot, it wasn't a
Right.
bunch of
Right.
patriots up in there. He's like, all right, I'm about to go get this check.
Yep.
And then I'm gonna come home and maybe I'm gonna do something for myself, my mother, brother, sister, friends, kids, whatever. And that was the situation, and it feels a lot like that. There is something about, and this is gonna sound fucked up. There does feel like there's a relationship between that and this too,
Uh-huh.
in selling the book in this way. And we like to think that the book stuff is real different, or
Right.
it's
Right.
like so detractive. Like we're like
Right.
special people who make
Right.
books, not people who do this other thing, right?
Right.
I mean, it's complicated. I don't know how completely true that is, but I try to be like, I'm gonna try do my best, right, to write this shit as faithfully as I can and not care as much about the selling part, right? Like
Yep.
about how hard I'm gonna go. I mean, and I was asking you about this not that long ago,
You
right?
were.
About
You
like
were. You were.
about how hard should I try and go on that. But it's true, and I've heard you say this like, all right, well, you got like a whole white literary establishment in front of you. Uh, it's just not true that you can just go like one to one
Right.
doing this shit only in the way that you think is like appropriate, or is going to work well. So I mean, the truth about that is like I really went out of my way to do the best I could in like gathering like friends and people that I fucked with prior who were going to have their hands in the book,
Yes.
and being like, okay, so I knew I wanted my editor to be Maddie because I had worked with her in the actual Grand Central, right? So I was like, oh, I actually know this person. This is not the first time I'm meeting and talking to this person. I asked you and a lot of other people, agent wise, about like PJ
Right.
specifically, right? Like I was trying to be as conscientious as I could, but
Yeah.
at the end of the day, like you are still selling some shit that's your insides. But it's important to make sure it's like not every single piece.
Absolutely.
That you have something, you got an interior life that don't have nothing to do
Yes.
with this as well, right? So
That's
that
so
part was
crucial.
also,
Ooh, I'm so
I
glad
wanted
you
to be clear
said
about
that.
that.
I listen. I can't wait to see you face to face in Houston. We gonna we
Yeah, I'm
gonna
looking forward.
we're gonna have a completely different conversation. But I also want to just thank Mark Twain House and thank Omar for giving us the time to do it the first time. We gonna meet up in Houston and do it again. And thank y'all for coming through. And if you haven't, y'all, you definitely got to get Sync. It's one of those memoirs that comes along. I think every 30, 40 years that changes the way we will write memoir. And I think the way we're gonna like think and write about like um actually like that sort of joyful feeling to me of acknowledging that you're sinking as a young person. I think what that's one of the things you do amazingly well, like the acknowledgement of sinking. um Actually just made me feel incredibly free. So thank you so much, Joe. I appreciate you, Bram, and thank you so much,
Thank
Omar.
y'all. Thank you, Kiese. Thank you, Mark Twain
Thank,
House
thank, yeah.
Museum.
Thank you so much, guys. It was an awesome conversation. It was just like listening to family talk. And I really appreciate that. That last question, I'm a writer outside of this day job, so it's certainly something that I've thought about. So that was a really good question, Kiese. And thank you so much, Joseph. I'm so looking forward to reading this. I resonate with it, with your story so much. You know, I've been through a lot of similar stuff, so I'm looking
Thank
forward to
you.
diving into it.
All right.
Thank you, man.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Have a
thank
great
y'all
night,
for coming
everyone.
too.
Thanks.
Okay.